West Hill United is a progressive spiritual community where how you live is more important than what you believe. West Hill United is a people, a place, an idea. We are a community living out of a progressive faith, striving to make a positive difference in our own lives, the lives of others, and the world. Join us Sundays at 10:30 a.m. or connect with us at any time.
The first reading is from the talks given by Ray Fadden. So I looked him up because I didn't know enough about him. And I found this, that Ray Fadden, part Mohawk, was a teacher. The Mohawk Nation adopted him into the Mohawk Wolf clan and gave him the name Tehanetorens, which has been translated as "he walks through the pines." It's lovely. In 1930, he became one of the first teachers at the St. Regis Mohawk School in Hogansburg in the States. He grew up in the Adirondacks Mountains, which, if you've ever been through, you can imagine the immense amount of natural beauty in those areas. And he tried to learn everything he could about the Mohawk history, the culture, their ways of living, their democratic ways. And he published articles that detailed these contributions, trying to make a difference in the then common image of Native culture as being backward and in need of help from our culture. So he was lifting up the value of what he found there. It was part of his, so he fought against what we're fighting against so much in so many areas, a negative characterization of someone else's culture because it is different. Because it is different. He published pamphlets, he published when he retired, he became as a school teacher. He established the Six Nations Indian Museum in Onchiata, where he continued to educate anyone that came close about the people, about environmental issues too, growing up where he grew up. He passed away in 2008 at the age of 98, having lived a well-lived life. His books include, and I had met one of them, but I didn't really understand his background, The Sacred Song of the Hermit Thrush, Legends of the Iroquois, Wampum Belts of the Iroquois, and The Roots of the Iroquois. And so that is Ray Fadden, and this is what Dave has chosen to share with us from his writings. Christopher Columbus wrote these words, this letter to the King and Queen of Spain. The letter is still in existence. Columbus himself had this to say about, and the word used in the writing is Indians. What they, the Indians, have they do not refuse to those who ask. With deep love, they prefer others to themselves. They give much for little and bear with small or no return. When we landed, women and men, children and adults, youth and old, forgot the fear they had felt for us and pursued to see us. A great crowd fell on the road, some bringing food, some drink, but all affected by the sweetest love and an almost unbelievable good will. But he goes on to explain that these people, this is so hard for me to read in the first and hard for me to say, but he goes on to explain that these people will be easy to enslave, since as few as 50 soldiers could easily capture or kill all of the inhabitants. So, the second reading. Second reading is a triplet of quotations from writers who addressed and modeled the subject of truth and truth-telling. The first is by Flannery O'Connor, an American author who wove themes of morality and ethics throughout her many works of fiction. The second is by the author Eric Arthur Blair, who you're very familiar with. Eric Arthur Blair, better known as George Orwell, was his name. An English novelist, poet, essayist, journalist, and social critic who opposed totalitarianism and supported democratic socialism. And the third quote is by the author William Faulkner, when the works of all American authors were banned during the Nazi occupation of France, an underground book movement formed, and evidently it was considered a daring, bold, and revolutionary move to read books by William Faulkner. And I thought that was pretty cool to know. Their quotes are on whatever paper someone took from my piano, and I'm just looking for it here now. The only one that might have done that is now approaching the piano. The second person who might have done that is now approaching. There, thank you. It was here. The third person who just muffed this up didn't realize it was here on my podium. So the three quotes from the people that I chose to supplement the readings for this morning. From O'Connor, "The truth does not change according to our ability to stomach it." The truth does not change according to our ability to stomach it. Orwell wrote,
Hello.
In a time of deceit, the truth is a revolutionary act. And Faulkner wrote, "Never be afraid to raise your voice for honesty and truth and compassion and against injustice and lying and greed. If people all over the world would do this, it would change the earth. Never be afraid to raise your voice." Offered as wisdom for the journey, may we walk.
May we walk in its light.
Dave, will you come join us at the front here and assist us in walking in the light of truth, which is such a strong theme in what you are bringing to us? Dave.
I want to talk about fairness. Scott got us started. You've done that every time so far. the intro at the very beginning when you spoke about that. So you may not get practical everyday tools for reconciling with our Indigenous people sponsors, but you'll get some light bulbs and hopefully one that turns something on for you. Can a white guy teach this stuff? Well, absolutely I can. I'm a racist today, standing here in front of you, embracing my admission. Am I proud of it? No, I'm not. Am I ashamed of it? No, I'm not. I was taught that whites are superior, and I'm being taught it every day, still at this late date. I should emphasize, I use that. I have a little button that says, from years and years ago I made, that says, yeah, I know I'm racist too, but I've learned that it's a subject, it's very embarrassing. So let me point out that racist actions and activities we do not approve. Racist thoughts and ideas we should accept, and I even say embrace. So when I make that term racist, I do that for, I guess, a bit of shock value, but also to start to make this point, which you'll see me getting into, pointing the finger back at ourselves a little bit. So is it fair that white superiority is built into our language? Our language teaches us. So we're being taught every day as we listen to our coded language and in outdated words that actually they build images into our minds and into the minds of children, which we all were at one point too, and that it can be very powerful and they don't necessarily go away. So you'll hear me emphasizing this, that yes, were we conditioned? Yes, we were. Can a white guy teach this? Sure. I can teach you to accept racist ideas in yourself. It's a natural outgrowth of racist economic practices in place for over 400 years. And we're talking about more racist than just indigenous here, but some of these comments may spill over into all the different areas of our culture, which I'm labeling us as the dominant culture, although I don't know you very well, like all of you, but I'm just kind of using that as a blanket term. So is it fair that we've always taught that nothing was accomplished in North America, in South America, in Africa, and in Australia? In fact, you notice when I say that, you think of that. If you take Antarctica out, I mean, there's 6 continents left, and there's 4 of the 6 that were just conquered and brutalized, really, when you look at it. And there is an invisibility around the issues, Africa, South America, and North America accomplishments, Australia, and where things stand. So that there's just the sheer domination of that sometimes strikes me when I'm naming these 4 continents. So is it fair that we were not told about 70 million dead Africans over 300 years? Is it fair that we were not told about 90 million dead Western Hemisphere indigenous over 300 years? So think of that. The population, in the year 1500, the population of the whole earth was 500 million people. We're talking about 70 million Africans over 300 years, 90 million Western Hemisphere, and the population by 1800 was around a billion people in the year 1800. So like thousands of other truths, I mean, these are not proud stories, not appropriate for kids' history lessons, not appropriate for our history books, not something that's going to necessarily uplift our day when we hear them, but that's how we get into this situation sometimes, that as we've spoken about the previous times that I've been here, is the being proud feels good, being ashamed, not so much. So that can easily get us going down this road of taking the easiest path, I guess is one way to put it. So where does fairness begin? Well, I'm not really intending to be negative here, but you'll hear me talk about pointing the finger back at ourselves. So I mean, human nature is at play here. Human nature comes into this. It's natural to fight these things when we hear about some of the Eurocentric examples. I like some of them, like the Appian Way, for instance. The Appian Way, most of us know about that. We're taught about it. It's Roman roads that they built. It's 600 kilometers long. The Inca road that I've referenced before, that is easy for me to just go 10 minutes on the Inca road, because it was it's a lot more than just the building of the road involved with the story of that. But that was 40,000 kilometers. He used to say, that's the breadth of the earth, right? 25 miles or 40,000 kilometers? Not loud. Really? Oh, okay. I know I can always snap this out and walk around. So 40,000 kilometers. So the Appian Way, 600 kilometers. Everybody's heard of that. For some reason, it's invisible, the fact that the Inca Road is a great, or the Royal Road, 40,000 kilometers long. It would stretch from Vancouver to Newfoundland. Not only that, there's 2 of them. There's one along the coast and there's one in the mountains. The pyramids in Egypt. You ask little kids, I don't know about today, probably even today, ask them about the pyramids. How many pyramids? There's 3. Everybody knows. Where are they? Egypt. Right? That's just common knowledge. This is what I mean, these examples about what you could use Eurocentric, which sounds a bit derogatory, I guess, but just that these are things that are drilled into us. And the pyramids in Mesoamerica, which is Central America, there's some areas, there's thousands of pyramids in these areas, Guatemala and Honduras and these places. Some of them are taller than the biggest pyramid in Egypt. Some of them are longer or larger at their breadth, at the bottom as well too. But again, there's an invisibility pattern with some of these things. So I like the potatoes example too. I do have a long list in my book of names of things that we have, where European names are given to things. But I like the potatoes one. Potatoes in one Indian nation in Peru, by the way, gave a lot of foodstuffs to the world. 80 different food plants they contributed to the world, than all Europe put together. So the Italians, the Czechs, the Poles, the Germans, the French, the English, like the whole works in Europe did not give as much as that one Indian nation. 80 food plants they gave, and one of them was the potato. And they had between 5,000 and 6,000 different types of potatoes, right? But what do we usually call the potato if we're coming up with like a common name? If you think of it, it's called the Irish potato, right? It just sends this image that the Irish had something to do with the potato. And you've got Hawaiian pineapple, you've got French vanilla, Belgian chocolate, vanilla and chocolate and cocoa, they all came from here. There's lots and lots of these. Turkish tobacco, Italian tomatoes, these names, there's a lot of these types of names. And they give a really good example of how we get off course with this stuff, and we just wind up making things that, I'm so surprised that bouncing balls came from the Western Hemisphere. They had rubber, and they were doing more than just balls, which the Europeans were afraid of these things. They were doing more than playing sports, too. They had rubber ponchos and rubber boots and some of these sorts of things. But the book industry is just on and on. So many of these things where people are so surprised. Oh, that's so interesting. But until the anthropologists give the go-ahead so that the historians can write the book, so that the teachers can then take the history books and start teaching, it's difficult to get this stuff into the mainstream. And they're doing a lot. You talk to kids now, and it is amazing. And a lot of our information the last 10, 15 years, as we know, it's improved dramatically. But still, there's a pretty big gap there sometimes. It's surprising. And so invisibility is the key to having the continuation for racist things in general. So there's a kind of a formula when it comes to racism, is that we've turned it into a moral issue. So that if someone suggests that you said something racist, it's a horribly embarrassing thing, and it's a quiet subject. You don't talk about it. The idea is that, no, I would never do that. You're bad. And so by turning it into a moral issue like that and making it a non-subject, something we're not going to talk about if we do hear something or if it's suggested in any way, you just shut up about it. And you shut up about it for year after year and generation after generation. So you free the slaves in 1860 in the United States. 1960, they still haven't voted yet, right? It kind of goes underground, a lot of this stuff. But these types of examples where it's turning it into a moral issue, this invisibility helps the cause of those that are in the dominant culture that would just love to see everything continue the way it's going, right? Very difficult for the cause of people who would like to change. Get the people on the fringes and give them some more rights and let them be more a part of some of the benefits of what we're doing in our civilization. So that invisibility is the key to having this continuation on these racist things. And the invisibility exists in the subject I talk about, these extraordinary number of native gifts to the world. And it just gets kind of shunted aside. So people kind of feel unusual sometimes at the end of one of my, what I call fire hosing talk, like I kind of the first time I just try to blurt out so many of these things all at once, but that there's a tendency to to fight that. We gravitate to what we've been taught as a defense mechanism right off the bat. So when you hear about democracy, it's like, well, there's Greece, or when you hear about the Constitution, the Haudenosaunee had, you think of the Magna Carta, and you can read the Magna Carta easily, and the people aren't mentioned anywhere. It was just the king's. The king was rearranging the situation with the nobility, keep the nobles happy, but it was only to the nobles. I mean, the people aren't really mentioned in that at all, and yet we were taught the Magna Carta. So the mind goes to these things right away. For corn, it's like, well, for a long time, that was the only contribution that would ever be taught in schools. Well, the Indians are this, and the Indians are bad, and they taught kids this. The only good Indian is a dead Indian, and those were like curriculum things. But the Indians did give us one thing, which was corn. That's the one thing. But what did we grow up with? With these terms we have like Indian givers, where they go back on their word. Indian corn is this colored corn. It's a decorative thing. It was not even food to us, right? This term, quote, Indian corn. There's another kind of example of that. It's a defense mechanism we go to think, well, you know, they couldn't have been that advanced, right? Look, we came in and we killed them, slaughtered them, and took over so easily. It couldn't just be steel, and the fact that Spain was at war for 800 years, it's got to be more to it. They were primitive people, right? This kind of, we hope that becomes true, because it all makes a little more sense then. We don't have to look too far in at what were the activities, so how did that actually happen, all that stuff. So make no mistake, we were conditioned very thoroughly. I guess I've got that point across by now. So the doctrine of discovery, as I would submit that you need to know about the doctrine of discovery to be an educated person in the 21st century period. So the doctrine of discovery is the foundation of all of our laws today, although you can get a lot of politicians, people debating that. Of course, it's an ongoing, long debate that won't end anytime in the next 50 to 100 years, probably. So in 1453, there was what they call a papal bull. So the Pope, there was just one person in charge of the Christian religion at that time, the Pope. It was before the church branched off. So 1453. And they called these papal bulls. They were like rulings that were given, or edicts, rules and guidelines given by the Pope. Now, Europe was all run by kings and queens. So it was a 100% dictatorships at that time. The kings and queens ruled by the divinity, by God. So you had God, and then you had the Pope, who was next in line, and then the kings and queens ruled by the authority of the Pope, really, and that's how the whole system ran there. And that's why they were so shocked, as we mentioned last time, when explorers started coming back and saying, oh, these people, they live over there without a king, and you know, they were kind of afraid of it. So the kings and queens would go to the Pope for guidance and for rules and rulings and stuff like this, and that's what these papal bulls were. So in 1453, Alexandra, the Pope Alexandra, gave this papal bull, which is sort of the foundation of our doctrine of discovery. There was 1453, and then I'm going to talk about 1493. But in 1453, he said it's okay to, if you're there to spread Christianity to the pagans and to the heathens, then it's okay to enslave them, and it's okay to take their land. And it's okay to kill them if you have to, and if it's okay to take their belongings from them. So this gave guidelines to the kings and queens so they would know what to do with Africa, which the slave trade, and they didn't start it. The slave trade had been going on there for a while. The Middle East was very involved with that as well too, but they needed some guidance on this. So skip ahead to 1493, the one that's more known and more apropos to the way we live today. Now, as early, Columbus went over in 1492. As short a time as 1493, in May, that short amount of time. Ferdinand and Isabella that sent Columbus over, they went to the Pope, they wanted a ruling on this new land. How is it going to work? And so he reiterated, Nicholas, was it Nicholas? Yeah, I think it was Nicholas. He reiterated in his intercessoral bull, his papal bull, he reiterated that it's okay to take their land, okay to kill, okay to enslave, okay to take their belongings. And the belonging was a big part. A lot of it was about gold, huge amounts of gold. It wasn't just the wealth, even not counting the land, the lumber, the resources, all this, just the wealth alone in gold and silver that moved from Western Hemisphere to Europe. We're still dealing with it today. European wealth and the fact that they dominate the world, and that includes us, by the way, Canada and the US. Yes, we're part of that. the amount of wealth that traveled from the Western Hemisphere to Europe was unbelievable. And that set the stage for the situation in the world today, the amount of wealth in Europe. But anyway, that was just one part of it. Basically, okay to take the land, okay to enslave, okay to kill, okay to steal their stuff. And then they split the land between Portugal and Spain. That was really partly what the king and queen were after. They needed to know, okay, who's going to get what and how does this work? So that's called the doctrine of discovery. And so let's switch to Canada a little bit here now in the news. So you hear these things, and even a few years ago, I didn't even know when I'd hear about unceded territory, and I had to look it up, unceded. Okay, it means they never really sat down and said, what are we going to do about this problem? Oh, the Europeans are flowing in here, and this land was ours. And unceded means they never agreed to anything. They never did anything. Now, the treaties that we see all the time, the land acknowledgements now are a big deal, and we're on Treaty 7 land and all this. So we see this stuff with treaties, could be called ceded land, like agreements were made, but the behavior didn't change. Treaty land, unceded land, and all the same behaviors happen. I mean, you did have a lot of people coming in. So I don't think they had a real sense of goodwill, but no one wakes up in the morning and says, I just want to be evil today. I mean, the odd person maybe here and there, very rare, I think. We just kind of meander along, and generations later we go, wow, look what happened there. So you can be sure we're doing something today that someone will look at 100 years from now and say, wow, look what they were doing. Didn't they realize? So it's good to remember that. I'm like, wow, okay, what are we doing? And so unceded land, you hear about it in British Columbia particularly, the last 2, 3, 4, 5 years, this unceded land out there. So I'm going to give you a little background on like what's happening there. Okay, James Cook. We learned about James Cook, Sir Francis Drake. We revered these people when we were little kids. James Cook was an explorer. He is known for going to Australia, and he was in the news in Australia in the last 2 years because they're looking for some apologies and some reparations. But it's well known that Cook took his ships to Australia, and they kidnapped 12 to 15-year-old girls, like sometimes dozens of them, and they would keep them on their ship as sex slaves. And some of the behavior of these people, the people on these ships, was just horrendous. So it wasn't just conquering and brutalizing, and they were just there to sort of satisfy themselves in some ways. So Cook is known to be the one who came to the west coast of Canada along BC. And here's how it worked. This is the doctrine of discovery playing itself out, and then we're hearing it on the news here in the 2020s. He went by a river in BC, so I'm going to sort of paint a picture. It's not historically accurate, but like every 20 years, here's kind of what the type of thing that would happen. So he goes by a river in BC, and he ticks that off. He's got somewhat of a map that they're making. He ticks that off. Okay, we went by this river. Now we own this river. Britain now owns that river, and they own the entire river and all the land around the river for a certain number of like miles around it, and they own all the tributaries of the river. So now they just own all this land, and all they did was go by in their ship and make a note of it. So okay, so that's fine. So let's say now 20 years later, you have somebody come, there's this river in BC that Cook discovered, so they want to go up and they maybe just make an appearance up in the river, right? There's people living there. Yeah, it's just like the rest of North America. There's not people everywhere, but there's obviously all the territory is taken. There's boundaries. There's people living there. They know who lives on what land, so they would bump into each other. So they were at that point visitors. So they would visit, but they think they own the land, of course. But the indigenous don't know anything about that. And so let's say another 20 years goes back, and more visitors come. Now, because it's getting to be known, okay, there's this land over there on the west of this area, and so some more visitors come now. And I always equate it to your house. Let's say somebody comes to your house, right? And they at first they just say, they knock on the door and they just say hi, and you say, fine. And then maybe they come back later, and there's two of them, and they say, you let them in for a coffee or something, and then they come back again later, and they end up staying overnight, and then pretty soon, anyway, that analogy, I might, if I keep my thread organized here, I might come back to that. But let's go back to this river now. So then you've got some people who come up the river, and they're not visiting now. They're staying there. They're having a little small settlement. You could call them guests now, right? Indigenous aren't kicking them off or fighting them, or they're not. They may have welcomed them at first, but they're just there, and there's lots of land. So let's say another generation goes by. Now a few more little homes or dwellings pop up along this river, and you're talking about I should know the river for this story. That would sure help it out. I've told it enough times. I should have a name for the river. Anyway, there's a lot of different smaller branches of the river, and there's a lot of land. So you've got people that are now settling there. Now, let's say another 20 years goes by, and now the settlements are becoming a little bit bigger, and they're sharing resources with the indigenous now. Still not necessarily a lot of friction, but it does come up because they're sharing resources. They run into each other. They're communicating with one another. They know each other are there. The indigenous are probably starting to think, where is this going to go, kind of thing. Okay, so let's say another 20 years goes by. Another generation comes now. Now more settlers are coming in, and it's starting to get crowded now. There's more towns. There's more settlements. And so the indigenous are getting pushed out. It's kind of like in your house, okay? You've got three or four bedrooms, and now these guests that came, they're becoming intruders. Like they filled up every bedroom now, and then they want us to sleep in the living room now, right? That's kind of the way it's gotten. But there's more coming. Another 20 years goes by, now there's more. Thousands and thousands are coming, and you've got settlements everywhere, and the indigenous get moved right off their land. Now, let me segue. This happened all over the world. This has happened. Tens of thousands of times. The same pattern. You can take the Western Hemisphere, which is my specialty. The same pattern. Always with displaced indigenous. They get moved to a land that's useless. It's the dams coming through. It's some toxic soil there. Well, you can be farmers now. You've been hunters for thousands of years, but now you can be farmers. Go over into this area, and they give them some soil that you can't hardly grow stuff on like that. Those are all very, very common type of stories and things that happen. So they get shunted off to the side. There's nobody with an evil plan to get them out of here. I mean, at some point, the governments did get involved. Okay, do we assimilate them, or do we kill them, or what do we do? So there does develop insidious plans to, what are we going to do with these people? They're not going away. But that's not, I don't think any of the settlers originally think that way. They'd be more like you and I. It's like, okay, we're coexisting, but just people are coming in. So now the indigenous are moved off of their land. And then what happens after another generation or two? 20 years, 40 years. What do you think happens with those settlers? Now the indigenous aren't on the land anymore. They're out of sight, out of mind. There's your invisibility. What do you think? They're busy with their lives, just like us. The kids come up, it's never mentioned, it's not on the landscape at all, it's not part of on their radar or anything like that. They forget. They forget all about it. And that's how things become invisible. And now when you hear this news thing, this unceded land, well, these people, they're building a ski resort here. It's exclusive ski resort. People fly in from helicopter. The super uber wealthy will come in. And we don't want them there. That's our land. We've been there thousands of years. We don't have much left, right? And so they take the road. The construction equipment's already here. They're starting in 2 weeks. What are they supposed to do? Now, we've got the army coming in now, and we're going to clear this road so the construction equipment can get through, and we're building this resort. You want to block the road? Go ahead and try. We'll put you in jail. Like, that's the stuff we hear about in the news, but we don't hear kind of what led up to that, which is what I'm trying to paint a picture of sort of how does this stuff develop. So let's go to Ontario. You maybe heard about Caledonia, and that's been in the news a lot for 10 years. I think they've been camped out there, I don't know, decades, ever since I can remember in the news anyway. So there's the Haldimand Tract, 1784. It was a law. Okay, when the British fought, the Iroquois Confederacy fought for the British, and they were strong, and they fought well, and did a magnificent job, and they had a big impact on the British winning. And the British knew that, and the British thanked them, and the British awarded them, and the British rewarded them, and they gave them the Haldimand Tract. Now here's what the Haldimand Tract is. The Grand River that runs in through from Fort Erie, all of the Grand River until the end of it, and all the land for 10 kilometers on either side. Can you imagine that? Okay. Does anybody in here know anybody who owns land in Kitchener, Waterloo, Cambridge, Dunnville, Brantford? Any of those places? That's what the Haldimand Tract is from 1784. Here's what they said, the British. By the way, those are a few of the cities. I counted the other day, I wanted to prepare, and I was counting the other black dots in there, and I counted about 30 black dots. I mean, that goes up to Grand Valley, Wareham, in that area where the headwaters are, because it was to the headwaters of the Grand River. That's what they said. So 6 miles deep, this is the quote now from the Haldimand Tract from 1784. You will have 6 miles deep from each side of the river, beginning at Lake Erie and extending in the proportion to the head of said river, which them and their posterity are to enjoy forever. Now, what do you think happened? Remember my story from BC? A few people come in. You think the government's going to say, no, 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 no. We're going to be strict about it this time. No. A few people come in, like, what are you supposed to do? Some farmers come, they take some land. Now there's a little settlement, a town. And now here we are. We've got Kitchener, Waterloo, Cambridge, everything else. It's it's Indian land. It's theirs, right? So that's the Haldimand Tract. That's happening right here. Now, do we know about the Haldimand Tract? I mean, I just found out about it a few years ago myself. It's like, you're kidding. Right here in Ontario, and the same thing happened to me with Gaspé, where I have Patterson relatives from Gaspé, right? And then one day I got thinking, wait a minute. The same story is going all over. I'm teaching this stuff. I had never looked up Gaspé. Sure enough, there was indigenous areas around Gaspé, and they got pushed out by Pattersons, right? So it's like, oh, oops. Anyway, so when we see treaty lands references, it's the same whether they're unceded or ceded. I mean, the pattern of behavior is still the same. Is it easy to fix back then or now? No, it's a tough situation. People just came in. And unless you are really gung-ho about enforcing some of these treaties, which never happens at all, even today, you're going to have a situation develop like that. It's whoever has the more dominant ability, I guess, to control that land. Okay, so that's the Haldimand Tract. So no one is really guilty here. I mean, you won't find anyone who really should have any guilt about it. But we do, in our culture, we do want to take all the credit for stuff. This is not long ago, you could call it the white man's civilization. It was called that. They would say, Indians, you must learn to assimilate. Your old ways are gone forever. You must learn to assimilate to the white man's civilization. Well, this is not the white man's civilization. Everyone in the world contributed to our civilization. And it's easy to prove that. So that's just arrogance to call it the white man's civilization. But it's not that long ago that was kind of the terms that would be used, right? But we kind of want to take credit for all this. And I don't care if it's the cure for scurvy or Belgian chocolate, whatever. we want to take credit for all this. We thought all this up over there. That's the line I always like to teach kids. We thought all this up over there, and yes, you're welcome. Like, you should be thanking us too, right? But we didn't think all this up over there. We're just one part of a big stew that goes into making up our civilization. So we want to take all the credit, but what happens with the bad stuff? Well, that's my ancestors, What's it got to do with me? Like, we want to have it both ways, right? Kind of. We want all the good stuff, which is the proud side. And then, well, what's that got to do with me? That's the not so proud side or ashamed or whatever. So it goes back to that. So let's look at some human behavior when it comes time to go deeper into this subject, with I equated to racism earlier, so this will kind of be partly the subject on this as well too. Indigenous racism is a much different picture in Canada because they look like us. We're bombarded with American stuff, right? And a black versus white culture, you got a completely different set of dynamics. So that's a whole weird subject that's not touched on too much, is the proportions of people we see in our commercials in Canada that are black, right? America's 19% black. In Canada, 3% is black. 5% is Indigenous. But they kind of look like white people. So it gets kind of difficult to say, well, what is racism exactly? Is it just we're talking about visible minorities here, or are we talking about what we do to the different cultural groups in our society, like how are we treating them, right? So it can get a little, I don't have all the answers either, but so we don't always look at our own progress in these areas of when it comes to human behavior, when we go deeper into this racism. And yes, we have racism for Indigenous in Canada, even though we can't spot them as easily on the street when we see the family. So we tend to want to look at the other guy, not always look at our own progress. So the safest place to point our finger kind of becomes somewhere else other than us. Like it's easy to, sometimes our first reaction is, well, yeah, but look at this, and it's just a human nature thing, and so it doesn't mean that we're bad or anything. So here's a quick story, or a quick kind of a rundown of a generational thing. So you hear these terms, Gen Z, the Gen Z kids, right? Remember who they are? So, not many know who your Gen Z are. So those are our 25-year-olds down to our 8-year-olds. They call them Generation Z. So I have 2 of them. So they're any younger than that, they're like Gen Alpha, and they don't really talk politics much. So listen to Gen Z now, and this becomes generational. We'll see what we all tend to do with these uncomfortable subjects like racism, for instance. So just listen to Gen Z. We support Indigenous protests because we're not racist. Because after all, just look at the racist attitudes of those who don't support Indigenous Lives Matter. Okay, so there's your Gen Z. Now here comes Gen Y, the millennials. Okay, 40 years old down to 25 years old. Now these are just approximations, but we know Gen Y, right? So here they are. We treat all ethnic Indigenous people equal because we're not racist. Because after all, just look at the racist attitudes of those who don't speak up about the mistreatment. Okay, now Gen X, that's 1965 to 1979, so 55 to 41-year-olds. We're sensitive to Indigenous issues because we're not racist. Because after all, just look at the racist attitudes of the white establishment leaders who won't give equal opportunities to Indigenous minorities. So now we're getting a little older. They're each is pointing to the next. And then baby boomers, well, most of us probably. We sympathize with Indigenous because we're not racist. Because after all, just look at the racist attitudes of people in the news who yell white power and let the police attack their powerless citizens, right? So now next come the white power supporters. What do they say? We really try to help minorities because we're not racist. Because after all, just look at the racist attitudes of these fascist groups who are actively trying to frighten non-whites into silence. And it can go on. I don't know what they probably have a way of justifying it in their mind too. But it's just this finger, it's easier to point the finger back at ourselves and say, what, racist thoughts and ideas? Why would I try to do that? Because it's just the safest route to go, really. Once you start looking somewhere else, you realize, okay, well, that's never going to end well, right? So it encourages prejudice when we start toning down racism into, well, it's not really racist, or someone's accidentally racist. I can tell you the safest thing is not looking at the result of stuff, looking at the intention. And this isn't all me. I mean, we hear unconscious bias and all these terms. There's been a lot in the last 10, 20 years, research and stuff coming out, and adjusting our thinking on these things. So, but that waters down the impact. Well, it's not really racist, or nobody intended to be racist. So it's better to just skip what the intention was and just talk about really what was the impact of it. That's much more valid in that subject of discrimination. And we don't have a minority problem here. We don't have an Indigenous problem here. We don't have an intolerance problem here. These are all examples of that type of thing, right? And it feels like we don't sometimes. You can kind of fill in the blank sometimes with those words. So, is it fair that we think our whole civilization was thought up across the ocean in white man's land? When the fact is that all the peoples of the world have contributed equally. I mean, is that fair? Okay, so some good news. I always do my picking on white people, as I call it. I'm very white people myself. So the good news is, you ready for some good news? I'm almost wrapped up here. That we all have a fairness factor already built into us. It comes as standard equipment with every human being. And we're really lucky to have that. I mean, you already possess it. It's that nagging feeling that tells you that something isn't quite right. And you don't need to, look at the news or have me up here, pontificating to really get this. It just comes that something tells us, right? It's being bothered by something that keeps reoccurring to you. So as you go through parts of the Canadian journey, your built-in fairness factor will come to your rescue over and over and over, incorporating what you've discovered and sort of nagging you about the next steps, right? That's the growth side, I guess. So your difficult job is to just let it happen, and that is extremely difficult. So it's difficult because we're hardwired to treat new information as a threat. So, I mean, that's actually funny. I'll finish off with just a kind of a dichotomy. This talk, as I mentioned at the beginning of my other two, is a custom talk. I mean, I haven't done it before, so I may kind of wander around a little bit. But things occur to me as I'm doing it as well, too. So I realized that, anyway, it's funny that we actually are fighting our own wiring with this stuff and fighting our own physiology. Because as they've discovered with unconscious bias and some of these things, our filters in our mind literally do not let in information that doesn't already fit in with what we think. It's part of a survival technique. We don't want, it's protecting us from bad stuff out in the jungle, and it's also protecting us from ideas. If something isn't fitting into our worldview already, it doesn't even always make it through into us. So it's not easy. Like I said, our physiologist literally fights us with this stuff for new ideas to come in. We're not designed as biological beings for have new stuff coming all the time to us, right? So it fights. So we're fighting our own physiology. So if I could leave you with one thought, it would be this aspect of nature, this incongruity, that our system fights ideas that don't fit in, but it also provides this nagging fairness factor for us so that we can mitigate the damage and get a chance to prepare us for a livable future. Thank you. Thanks, Scott.
I'm just going to push you over there.
Yeah.
Dave, you have a wealth of information. You're packed full of information. It's brimming out, filling the room with that. We're left with images. I am seeing the British ship float by some land, looking out the window and saying, "We'll take that. That'll be ours." I'll never forget that. It's mine. And for all the ideas you brought to us, for that idea of justice for whom? And we want to keep resounding for all, for every and for all. So thank you for, again, riveting us into those realities, to not bypass reconciliation, to not bypass truth on the way to reconciliation, or we are not dealing with the facts.
Skip over
That's
uncomfortable little
For those of you that didn't see that, Dave just jumped to the left to indicate that we don't want to jump past the truth. I'm going to ask Babette just to send us off with our song. Again, thank you, Dave.
Become a sustaining champion of West Hill United's work by committing to an automatic monthly donation. Learn more or donate now through Canada Helps.